A piercing light split the darkness. It was that same sacred radiance that had once burned across the endless plains of heaven. Satan found himself locked in dream again, reliving the cataclysmic moment he'd fought against God, the very being who had crafted him with loving hands. He could hear the blasts of trumpets echoing through golden spires, feel the chorus of angels singing in harmonious terror as he rose in rebellion. He remembered flashes of steel and lightning, the sky itself torn asunder by divine fury. He remembered his own rage at the perceived injustices, the feeling of absolute conviction that he could make the cosmos more beautiful if only he could wrest it away from God. But it had all been for nothing. He was cast out, defeated, hurled through the silver gates of heaven and into the darkness below. And in the last moment before he slammed into that darkness, Satan had caught his own reflection in the shards of celestial crystal, a face full of sorrow, arrogance, and a desperate longing to beautify creation. That was the final memory that echoed in his mind before he snapped awake. He emerged from the dream covered in shimmering sweat, lying on a stone bench in an abandoned courtyard somewhere in the modern world. Dawn had not yet broken, only the faint glow of street lamps lit the deserted back alley in which he sat. Satan's heart pounded, if indeed he had won, and an echo of frustration throbbed through him. He hated how the modern world perceived him, a leering devil with horns and sulfuric breath, the eternal boogeyman used to frighten children and rebuke sinners. He had seen the ridiculous costumes, the caricatures on television, the cheap plastic horns in novelty shops, the shallow references in pop culture. None of it captured the elegance and dignity he believed he possessed. He rose to his feet, still dazed from the dream, letting the golden curls of his hair glimmer in the flickering lamplight. Indeed, he looked beautiful, unearthly, even. His slender face was neither masculine nor feminine but possessed of an angelic allure. His eyes shone like polished sapphires, flecked with subtle streaks of gold. The few passers-by who dared glance at him in the early hours of the morning found themselves entranced. But in the next instant, Satan felt an uncomfortable jolt somewhere within him. It was as though an invisible cord inside his chest had been tugged. For centuries, humans had used his name as a tool of fear without truly believing in the actual being. Now that so many modern souls treated him as myth and metaphor, his existence was in jeopardy. If no one truly believed in him, then he might as well be a rumor on the wind. Already, his body flickered like a faulty hologram. A tinge of panic laced his thoughts. If he could not convince humanity of his reality, he would vanish into the void of the lost, where all forgotten legends drifted into non-existence. Determined to push that outcome away, Satan walked the streets in search of those who might hear him. At first, nobody paid attention. Even the few who stared at his perfect features assumed he was a particularly obsessed eccentric, just another Satanist with dyed hair and too much theatrics. Rumors began to spread through social media that a strange and mesmerizing man was walking the city proclaiming himself to be the real devil, but the posts were drowned out by people's daily flood of trivial content. Every time he tried to gather a crowd, the onlookers seemed to see his fading form and concluded his illusions were failing. They believed it a cheap magic trick, not the unraveling of his very existence. Still, that fleeting interest and the seeds of curiosity about the supernatural kept him from vanishing entirely. Like a plant that survived on the faintest trickle of water, Satan clung to that meager nourishment. As more people saw him, a few curious souls came forth, enthralled by the combination of his inhuman beauty and the obvious strangeness of his disappearing limbs. They asked him questions, some earnest, some scoffing, and demanded demonstrations of miracles or magic. Eager to solidify his presence, Satan tried to weave small illusions of light and conjure ephemeral shapes in the air. Sometimes the illusions flickered or died outright, other times they burst in radiant swirls. When he succeeded, the watchers would gasp, pushing away doubt, allowing themselves to believe, and restoring some measure of Satan's tangibility. But it was never enough to fully convince the masses, who remained skeptical of anything that defied their grasp of reality. Realizing he needed a more profound strategy, Satan retreated to a remote, decrepit warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He invited the small handful of believers who had been touched by genuine curiosity about his origins. 12 in total arrived, each with a different background. Some were board office workers, others were disillusioned dreamers, and a couple were conspiracy theorists who'd yearned for a real supernatural encounter. He introduced himself not as the Prince of Evil but as a fallen angel, one who had once sought to improve creation itself. He explained that the old notion of magic was misunderstood in the modern age. Magic, as humans once called it, was never separate from belief. In a realm where belief is power, anything could happen if enough minds aligned on it. His words enraptured his meager audience. Some were thrilled by the idea of harnessing supernatural forces, others were drawn by the vision of reimagining the world into a place of transcendent beauty. Satan told them that the only thing necessary for magic to flourish was unwavering conviction. If one could let go of the need for physical proof and truly will themselves to believe, the boundaries of possibility would shift. He taught them to see the city around them as mutable, shaped by collective perceptions. To illustrate, he asked them to focus on a single candle flame in the dark warehouse. He asked them to collectively believe that the flame could grow larger. With some effort, they did, and the flame sputtered, brightening as though fed by an unseen gust. For one shimmering moment, it became a proud torch. Energized by the success, these believers pledged loyalty, viewing Satan not as an evil overlord but as a teacher who might give them the power to transform reality. They began their lessons in earnest, spending long hours chanting incantations, practicing illusions, and bending the flickers of reality through sheer force of will. Satan had not felt such purpose in eons. If these few could become living proof that wonders were possible, then the rest of humanity might also awaken to the idea that magic existed, that supernatural forces could be real. And if enough people believed in him, he would no longer risk fading into oblivion. Yet, as the days wore on, Satan noticed something disturbing. The students developed an alarming sense of self-importance. They yearned to be recognized as powerful mages and began fostering their own arrogant fantasies. One aspiring illusionist, a wiry man named Julian, started spending nights locked in a mirror hall, crafting illusions of grand kingdoms in which he was king. Another student, Farah, claimed to have discovered secret runes and wards that only she could interpret, warning that Satan's teaching was too narrow. Night after night, they practiced in secrecy, stoking the embers of vanity until they believed they had surpassed their mentor. Their illusions became potent but chaotic, each shaped by personal, deep-rooted delusions of grandeur. Satan watched with mounting concern as small groups of pupils murmured among themselves about forging their own paths. They questioned why Satan alone should stand at the pinnacle. Had he not lost the great war in heaven? They began to suspect that his famed beauty was just a veneer for weakness, that maybe the real cosmic power lay within themselves. Furthermore, they realized his existence was contingent on people's belief. The logic crystallized: if they all began believing that Satan was inferior, that they themselves were the rightful new pantheon of cosmic forces, perhaps they could wrest reality to their favor. Satan tried to warn them that such illusions were dangerous. Untested power fueled by delusion was a path that led nowhere good. But his warnings only served to reinforce their beliefs that he feared them. In desperation, Satan demanded they demonstrate the techniques he taught them in structured sparring sessions, a means to discipline their craft. He created a vast makeshift arena within the warehouse's hollow interior by painting sigils across the concrete floor. Flickering magical wards ringed the circle, designed to contain the illusions so they wouldn't run wild. He hoped that, by observing them in organized magical combat, he could correct their mistakes and curb their surging arrogance. What followed, however, was beyond anything he had predicted. The students, thriving on the competitive atmosphere, treated each match as though it were an apocalyptic showdown. They howled the names of their attacks with dramatic flair and summoned swirling illusions of lightning dragons, blossoming infernos, and serpentine mists. The matches were so over the top and chaotic that sparks ignited inside the old warehouse, scorching the rafters and sending lines of flame dancing across the dusty floor. Despite Satan's efforts to keep the matches in check, a strange phenomenon emerged. Because so many of them believed in their own power more than they believed in Satan's, the illusions they conjured began manifesting beyond his control. When he tried to quell a fiery explosion conjured by Farah, his protective wards faltered. The rebellious minds in the arena were convinced that Satan's power was limited, and so it was. Their collective belief acted like a crushing gravitational field that bound him. With each student's demonstration of their illusory might, his luminous form flickered dangerously, as if he were struggling to remain anchored in reality. It wasn't long before these sparring sessions escalated into open defiance. Julian, the one who dreamed of kingdoms, challenged Satan before the entire group: if you are truly the grand teacher you claim to be, prove it, or face me in combat. Show us your shining illusions, or cower before the power you have granted us. His voice thundered with arrogance, and illusions of shimmering palaces materialized around him, each spire crowned with golden banners. Other students joined in the call for a battle, conjuring swirling illusions of monstrous creatures or brandishing ephemeral swords forged from concentrated belief. A couple among them still hesitated, glancing at Satan with concern, but the group's collective momentum was overwhelming. Sensing their lust for conflict, Satan did something he thought would shock them back to reason. He decided to give them their tournament, hoping to transform their rebellion into a structured gauntlet of duels. He wanted to prove once and for all that his knowledge and mastery were still superior, and perhaps break through their illusions of grandeur. The old warehouse, thoroughly warped by magic, expanded into a grand arena in their shared vision. Stadium seats of stone and marble illusions rose in a circular bowl around a central ring that resembled polished obsidian. The cold winter wind howled through cracks in the roof, but the swirling illusions of the students wrapped them in an otherworldly spectacle. Neon lights, swirling draconic illusions, and ephemeral wisps gave the setting a dreamlike, kaleidoscopic feel. He set the rule: each competitor would battle in a bracket, culminating in a final face-off with him. Satan wanted to be the last challenge, standing as the pillar they had to overcome, hoping that by the time they reached him, they'd understand how illusionary their inflated egos were. Or if they didn't, he would at least quell them. And so the tournament began. It was glorious, chaotic, and terrifying, all at once. Farah faced off against a fellow student, Kaido, who specialized in illusions of wind and swirling storms. Farah brandished an attack she called Arcane Dragon Bloom, forging a monstrous flower of flames that erupted into a serpentine dragon's head. Kaido countered with Tempest's Howling Fang, his arms crackling with illusions of swirling wind that cut through the dragon's fiery petals. The clash ignited the arena's illusions, and for a moment, they both lost themselves in the spectacle. Multicolored sparks rained from above as if the sky itself had been torn asunder. Eventually, Farah's illusions proved stronger, fueled by her overwhelming confidence that her secret wards made her unstoppable. Kaido was flung back, illusions shattering, leaving him unconscious and battered. The next bout saw Julian facing off against a cunning young man named Marcus. Marcus was quiet, watchful, always analyzing. He believed that illusions must be subtle to be most potent, while Julian believed in grand splendor. Before the match started, Julian leveled a haughty grin, summoning a regal throne behind him. He declared his next move, Celestial Tyrant's Dominion. Instantly, illusions of soldiers, banners, and swirling energies converged around him, forming an entire phantom army. Marcus breathed slowly and whispered, "Veil of the mind's eye," then turned invisible, weaving illusions to scramble Julian's sense of perception. For a heart-pounding minute, illusions of thousands of troops marched back and forth in the ring, while Marcus attempted to slip through the illusions and strike directly at Julian's consciousness. But Julian's confidence was unshakable. His illusions were so large, so all-encompassing, that they literally cornered Marcus. A single sweeping gesture from Julian conjured a wave of phantom knights that overran Marcus. With a final cry, Marcus collapsed under the weight of that mesmerizing onslaught, illusions fracturing like shards of stained glass around him. Match after match followed in similarly spectacular fashion. The illusions painted entire landscapes, swirling deserts, underwater palaces, or cosmic voids. Each competitor, fixated on outdoing the others, channeled increasingly brazen visions. Their chanting echoed, sometimes verging on maniacal laughter as they unleashed blasts of shimmering color. Every success fed their arrogance, and every illusion that soared uncontained chipped away at Satan's control over the arena. Worse, the crowd of onlookers, some still in the warehouse, some watching from illusions broadcast to them by the rebellious students, grew in excitement. Their belief in the rebels' power soared, while their faith in Satan remained uncertain. The more the crowd clamored for these new mages, the more Satan felt himself weaken. His own illusions flickered at the edges of the battlefield, and the sigils he had painted on the floor threatened to unravel under the weight of conflicting beliefs. Still, he had not yet stepped into the ring. He watched from the makeshift stands, arms folded, face grim. He was determined to hold back his powers until absolutely necessary. Just seeing his beloved illusions used for self-aggrandizement gnawed at him. It wasn't that he feared their strength, but that he worried about the path they tread. They were stumbling into the same arrogance that had led him to rebel against heaven. In a twisting irony, they were repeating the cycle of downfall he once had. His own memory of that betrayal pricked him like a thorn. He remembered seeing his own reflection in the shards of heaven and noted the same expression now flickering across the students' faces, delight at the prospect of rising above creation, of proving themselves mightier than the one they believed was a tyrant or a fool. By sunset, the final round of the bracket was set. Julian, Farah, and a newcomer named Mira had clawed their way to the top. Each believed themselves unstoppable, standing among the scattered illusions of vanquished rivals. However, Satan had one last student who had not battled yet. His name was Adriel. Quiet, composed, and fierce in his devotion to learning, Adriel had been one of the earliest believers who approached Satan with genuine curiosity. Unlike the others, Adriel seemed less tempted by illusions of personal grandeur. He often stayed behind after lessons to ask questions, to see if there was a deeper meaning or a moral dimension to the magic Satan taught. They had formed what Satan had believed was a sincere friendship, sharing personal revelations. Adriel had told him about the loneliness he felt in a world devoid of wonder. He confessed that discovering Satan's lessons was like finding a hidden piece of his soul. As a result, Satan nurtured Adriel's training more carefully. He had high hopes for Adriel, hopes that this student might, in time, stand as a shining example of what constructive magic and genuine belief could do. It was now Adriel's turn to battle in the final bracket. He stepped into the ring with measured steps, meeting Farah first. She launched a volley of illusions, gnarled vines of flame snaking across the obsidian floor. Adriel countered with a calm wave of his hand. "Abyssal Aurora," he said softly, summoning a veil of rippling auroras that gently swallowed Farah's fire. The technique was delicate but immensely potent. Farah tried to press her advantage, chanting her wards, but Adriel's illusions enveloped her, unraveling her illusions with minimal effort. She collapsed in the ring, illusions sputtering out like dying embers. Even Julian seemed momentarily impressed. Next, Adriel faced Julian. The Conjurer of Kingdoms smirked, summoning hundreds of phantom armies again. Adriel countered not with a massive display but with subtle illusions that attacked the foundation of Julian's illusions. He quietly induced doubt in Julian's mind, weaving illusions that hinted at the possibility that Julian's soldiers were mere illusions, that they couldn't withstand a simple wave of the hand. He sowed a seed of fear that they would vanish at any moment. Little by little, Julian's illusions faltered, as though invisible cracks formed in them. By the time Julian recognized the tactic, it was too late. With a final, measured command, "Eclipse of the Unbound Soul," Adriel conjured a great sphere of darkness that swallowed Julian's illusions and slammed him down. The thunderous impact left Julian unconscious, illusions shattered into a haze of swirling sparks. Standing at the center of the silent, awestruck arena, Adriel lifted his gaze to Satan. "Master," he said, voice trembling with a strange, layered emotion, "I'm ready for our final match." A hush swept through the watchers. This was the moment. Satan stood, glancing down at his student. Pride flickered in him, but so did a sense of foreboding. All around them, the rebellious students, battered but not broken, rose to watch with hungry eyes. They had begun to doubt their own illusions, but they still collectively believed that Satan could be toppled, that he might not be as great as he claimed. Their stolen confidence became a swirling vortex of contradictory beliefs. Some were in awe of Adriel's power, others scorned Satan, and many more simply wanted to see a climactic battle. Satan leapt into the ring with uncanny grace. Although he had tried to stifle it, he felt a thrill surge through him. Once, he had reveled in cosmic battles against archangels. A piece of that pride had never left him. He raised his arms, illusions of radiant golden wings unfurling behind him. The wards flickered, adjusting to his presence, and for a moment, his body stabilized. Enough people believed that he could still put on a show. With a resonant voice, he declared, "Behold the light of the morning star," and channeled a whirlwind of luminous shards into the sky. They coalesced into a single, shimmering spear, illuminating the entire arena like dawn breaking over a black sea. Adriel gazed up, seemingly amazed. "We stand upon the threshold of possibility," he murmured, eyes reflecting the spear's glow. "I once admired you for opening my eyes to all this, Master. Now, I will show you the ultimate truth we can reach." With that, he thrust his hands forward and roared, "Revelation of the Phoenix Crown." A vortex of blazing feathers erupted around him, each feather a manifestation of searing belief. They spiraled upward, forming a fiery helm that wreathed Adriel's face. Then, with a wave of his arm, the feathers shot forward in a swirl of majestic flame. The two powers collided mid-arena in a cacophony of crackling light and heat. Satan braced himself, pushing back with beams of golden light. Overhead, illusions of cherubic figures and swirling cosmic patterns reflected the magnitude of their conflict. The arena quaked, illusions fracturing into kaleidoscopic shards that rained down on the watchers, but the watchers themselves believed they were safe behind the wards, so the shards did little harm, except to ramp up the spectacle. Satan began to weave illusions that targeted Adriel's sense of self, trying to remind him of his initial humility and caution. But Adriel pushed back, forging illusions that bolstered his own confidence and sense of purpose. Their beliefs warred in the astral plane, turning the physical environment into a swirling canvas of color and form. Adriel's illusions took the shape of a massive phoenix with obsidian eyes, while Satan's illusions manifested as a colossal serpent of light. The phoenix lunged, talons outstretched, the serpent coiled, fangs glistening, cosmic stardust flaring in the background. The watchers roared, drawn into the clash. Some began chanting Adriel's name, hypnotized by his meteoric rise. Others cheered for Satan, enthralled by the regal brilliance of his illusions. Their collective beliefs seesawed back and forth. Satan felt his power surge whenever the crowd's awe toward him spiked, but then it ebbed when they switched to marveling at Adriel's feats. The spectacle soared beyond the confines of the warehouse. Visions of celestial battles and fiery wings projected into the night sky above the city. A few unsuspecting bystanders outside looked up in awe, inadvertently pouring more belief into the swirling illusions, some for the radiant serpent, some for the towering phoenix. Locking eyes with Adriel, Satan plunged deeper into their shared illusions, forging an all-consuming dome of shimmering starlight around them both. He poured what remained of his confidence into a single finishing move, determined to show he had not yet lost mastery. Celestial radiance, world-remaking dawn, he cried. A spiral of golden runes manifested around him, each pulsing with raw energy, each one a reflection of centuries of hidden knowledge. He launched the beams toward Adriel, intending not to destroy but to overwhelm, to show him the beauty that once made Satan revered. Adriel staggered under the barrage, forced onto his knees. His illusions wavered, the phoenix battered by that radiant onslaught. For a moment, it looked as though Adriel would concede. But then, the rebellious students, battered but present, began chanting his name. They remembered how Adriel had toppled them each in turn, how unstoppable he had seemed. They poured their belief into Adriel, convinced that he had the strength to surpass Satan. That belief coalesced around him like a fortress of conviction. Adriel looked up, tears in his eyes, as though something inside him had awakened. "I won't lose what I've gained," he whispered. "I won't go back to living in a world that doesn't believe in magic." He rose, arms spread wide, and roared, "Exalted Phoenix rebirth." The fiery bird that had nearly been extinguished ignited again, with a heat so intense it threatened to crack the illusions that formed the dome. The flaming wings soared high, overshadowing Satan's radiant serpent, and with a final, cataclysmic clash, the phoenix and serpent collided at the center in a blinding explosion of light and heat. Satan tried to brace himself, but in that microsecond, he felt the combined will of his rebellious followers hammering his psyche. They believed, without question, that Adriel was his superior, and so it became so. Satan's illusions cracked from within, the golden serpent unraveling into a cascade of shimmering dust. He felt a searing pain, though it was more existential than physical. His vision blurred, his form flickered. A collective gasp echoed through the arena as, for the first time, Satan collapsed to one knee. Adriel stood above him, illusions swirling around him like an inferno. A hush lingered for a heart-pounding beat. Finally, Adriel lowered his arms, illusions shrinking but still vibrant. He stared at Satan with a mix of triumph and sorrow. "Master," he said softly, "it didn't have to be this way. But I suppose we always outgrow our mentors eventually." Desperate not to be forgotten, Satan tried to rise, but realized his body was fading more quickly than ever. The watchers saw him flicker and assumed his illusions were crumbling. In truth, it was his entire existence that was dissolving. Panic flooded him. "Wait," he cried out, voice quivering. "You can't simply cast me aside. I am too beautiful to be forgotten." His words, once capable of swaying entire armies of angels, now rang hollow in the neon-lit air. The rebellious students sneered. Some laughed outright. Their eyes shone with the same delusional spark of having seen themselves ascend beyond their teacher. "Look at him," muttered Farah, who had rejoined the stands. "He boasts of beauty, but he has to beg us not to forget him," others murmured. "We're more beautiful than he is now. His illusions are outdated. His time has passed." In that moment, Satan saw in their faces the same arrogance he once displayed to God at heaven's gates. The memory stung him with a terrible clarity. They were mocking him for the very vanity he used to treasure. He had become the cautionary tale, precisely what he once accused God of being. Realization sank in like a blade between his ribs. Had he been chasing an impossible dream all along? Could it be that his self-proclaimed mission to make the world more beautiful was just the same twisted hubris that had brought him low in heaven? The illusions swirling around him suddenly felt tacky, flamboyant, and hollow. Doubt, that lethal poison, seeped into his spirit. He no longer believed in his own legendary beauty. And once his conviction in that faded, the rest of him began to slip away with terrifying speed. Adriel locked eyes with him, and for a moment, compassion flickered there. "I wish it hadn't come to this," he said, voice trembling. "But maybe this is how it always had to be." Satan could barely form a reply. His lips quivered. He felt the creeping darkness of the void of the lost pulling at him. The warehouse illusions wavered like ripples on a pond. The rebellious students, in their triumphant mania, seemed only half aware that reality itself was shifting around them. Once Satan was gone, the illusions might remain for a time, fueled by their own twisted self-belief, until they eventually imploded under the weight of contradiction and the quiet dryness of critical thought that would slip back in. At last, with what little voice he had left, Satan whispered, "I was a bad example for you all. In my desire to remake creation, I taught you arrogance instead of wonder. I taught you illusions instead of truth. He reached out with a trembling hand, but Adriel did not take it. All around them, swirling motes of light turned dull and gray. The watchers fell silent. Some felt pangs of regret, others felt only vindication. Satan's shimmering form dissolved steadily, bits of him blinking out like extinguished candles. Pain tore at him, but also a strange sense of release. He thought back to the pristine fields of heaven, to the voices of angels, to the comfort of knowing he'd once possessed a place in the cosmic tapestry. Then, for an instant, his mind drifted to the humans who might still be out there, those who believed in the possibility of magic, of wonder, without succumbing to illusions of grandeur. Perhaps they would pave a better path. Perhaps they would show that beauty could be found in humility, in cooperation, rather than rebellion. By the time the last flicker of his existence faded, Satan had accepted a grim truth: he was neither the ultimate embodiment of evil nor the shining savior of creation. He was simply another tragic figure in the grand story of humanity, an example of pride and hubris, and of how easily the desire to make things better could twist into something destructive when belief became blinded by arrogance. With that final surge of realization, the warehouse fell dead silent, illusions and flames guttering out in abrupt darkness, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and the distant hum of city traffic outside. For a long while, the student stood there, stunned by the sudden vacuum left in Satan's wake. Adriel trembled, arms wrapped around himself as though cold. He lowered his head, tears sliding down his cheeks. In the heavy silence, a few timid footsteps approached him. Julian, battered and singed, placed a shaking hand on Adriel's shoulder. Is he really gone? Adriel looked up at the vacant space where Satan had stood moments before. Yes, he whispered, his throat tightening on the single word. He could still feel the lingering resonance of that final clash, of their beliefs slamming into each other like titanic forces. And he felt, for the first time, a pang of guilt. Satan had taught him wonder, yes, marred by arrogance and illusions, but wonder nonetheless. Now, that wonder was tempered by loss. Farah's flame sputtered in her palms, then died. Julian's phantom soldiers vanished, leaving only dust motes dancing in the cold air. The illusions were still possible, they could still conjure them by their beliefs. But the guiding force that had first opened their eyes to the idea was now gone. Slowly, in the days that followed, the rebellious students began to face a sobering realization. Without Satan's presence, the illusions required more effort to sustain. Their group fractured into smaller circles, each with a different theory about what had happened. Some slipped deeper into delusion, wrapping themselves in illusions too thick to see any reality. Others, including Adriel, became disenchanted and afraid. Adriel wrestled day after day with the knowledge that he had, in many ways, caused his mentor's disappearance, and that in the end, he had become the very arrogance he once despised. Yet ironically, a handful of them found a kernel of truth in Satan's final warning. They realized that their illusions, magnificent as they were, could be dangerous lies if not anchored by humility. A new seed of self-awareness took root. Some among them tried to remember the positive side of Satan's teachings, the reminder that belief, when tempered with compassion and grounded in something greater than vanity, could indeed reshape the world for the better. But now they had to do so on their own, without the guidance, however flawed, of the one who started them down this path. Adriel, haunted by the final look in Satan's eyes, resolved to use his powers to help rather than dominate. He took to wandering the city at night, offering illusions to bring fleeting moments of beauty to those who needed hope, a projection of dancing lights for lonely children, an illusionary garden in the concrete gloom of an underpass. He never stayed long in one place, weary of fueling his own pride. Each time he crafted an illusion, he thought of Satan's last words. In his mind, there grew a conviction that while illusions could be wondrous, they had to be woven with self-knowledge and restraint. The world was complicated, seldom made better by the tyranny of a single will, whether that will was God's, Satan's, or one man's delusion. Julian, Farah, and the others drifted away on their own paths, some continuing to cling to their illusions of grandeur, others quietly repenting in their hearts. Whatever roles they would eventually play in the world remained uncertain. But one thing was sure, none would forget the day they stood in the presence of the being who called himself Satan, who once claimed to be the most beautiful of all creation, and who vanished when he finally doubted his own beauty. Word of that strange battle spread in hushed rumors among certain circles of paranormal enthusiasts and occult seekers. Some believed it wholeheartedly, claiming that they had witnessed illusions shimmering in the sky that night. Others dismissed it as mass hysteria or an elaborate hoax. In the end, it didn't matter which side was right in any conventional sense. The magic that had been unleashed left its mark on the minds of those who saw it. A few began to question the constraints of their reality, entertaining the idea that if they believed strongly enough, they too could bend the rules. But perhaps, with critical thinking, they would be more careful about what they chose to believe. And so the city settled back into its usual rhythms, the old warehouse now little more than a burnt-out husk. The swirling illusions were gone, but the faint echoes of that surreal night lingered. In the greater scheme of things, the history books didn't mark that particular battle, nor did the mainstream media. Most of humanity carried on with their day-to-day lives, too enmeshed in their own beliefs and disbeliefs to notice. But somewhere in that city, an unearthly hush slipped through a deserted alley, as though an echo of a voice long gone whispered, "I was nothing more than a bad example." No heaven-shaking fanfare announced it, and no funeral bells tolled. In the end, only a few souls truly grasped the lesson behind Satan's disappearance. Being delusional can make you feel unstoppable, but that power is built on a fragile foundation of self-deceit. Critical thinking can ground a person in reality, but it may also limit the possibilities one can perceive. And good intentions, if divorced from truth, can become ruinous. As the nights passed, the city lights blinked on and off, the endless hum of modern life forging ahead. And in that quiet interplay between belief and reality, the memory of Satan, his glory and his downfall, faded into the shadows, a cautionary tale for any who would listen. Still, in the hush before dawn, if one looked carefully, they might see a flicker of golden curls reflected in a window, or catch a glimpse of radiant eyes in the reflection of a rain-slick street. Maybe it was just a trick of light. Maybe it was the last haunting echo of a fallen angel's dream. Or maybe, in some hidden corner of the world, there remained the slightest seed of belief, a tiny spark of memory that refused to let the devil be completely forgotten, a testament, perhaps, that every story, no matter how tragic or arrogant, leaves behind a trace of possibility for those with eyes to see. And with that faintest wisp of magic, the city sighed and carried on, as illusions and truth continued their endless dance in the labyrinth of human belief.